Hi, everybody. It's my honor to moderate this debate, as I was sitting here at exactly the same place last year where there was only one debate about post-growth or degrowth, and today it's a whole day that we're discussing this topic, which I think is really an important and crucial topic to actually be discussing with this many people. So I'm really delighted by that. To introduce myself, my name is Tadeáš, Žďárský, and now I really try to focus on degrowth and spreading the ideas of degrowth in the Czech Republic, and that's maybe why I was invited to moderate this panel. Just so you would know about how it's going to work today, I'm going to introduce the panel, introduce the guest speakers, and we are going to talk for around an hour, which will be time that I'll be asking questions, and then there's half an hour for you to ask questions at the end. So hopefully there'll be plenty of time to explore the topics that you're interested in. This debate is, I think, I don't know what was the official name, but it's supposed to be about the quality of life in a post-growth world. And it's important to say, or maybe start this debate with pointing out that we're living in a time of a lot of crises that are interwoven. We cannot separate them. They have some common denominators. And we're looking ahead of how can we actually tackle these issues? How can we create a functioning society? And I think there are three main narratives in the public media, in the discussions, and stories about what to do now. One of them, we're very aware of that, that's business as usual, meaning let's close our eyes, not think about all these problems, and let's stick to the way we were doing business, we were doing politics, we were living our lives without actually changing anything much. The second narrative is this sort of doom and gloom, and really this place of hopelessness of being like, well, the collapse is coming, we cannot change that at all. Whatever we do, it won't be enough in order to make it. And then there is a third narrative that is this techno-utopian vision of green capitalism that will come up with all the solutions by innovation without us actually changing our lifestyles, the way we approach ourselves, the way we approach nature. And this seems to be, even in the current political debates today, the progressive so-called solution. And what this debate is going to be about is going to strengthen this fourth narrative that I think we often don't hear about at all, and that's actually a narrative of some kind of profound and pretty deep cultural transformation and economic transformation away from the growth-dependent economies, growth-dependent lifestyles, one could say also. And this is going to be the place where which we are going to explore today together. In order not to get stuck with the basics, I'm just gonna have like three main entry points which will set the tone for the debate. It's important for me to say that, yeah, I'm not a neutral moderator. I'm really interested in degrowth and how do we change the system. And so I'd really like to get into the juicy stuff that even we in degrowth circles don't talk about enough. And therefore, the basics will be said now, I hope, in the beginning. So we're in the times of climate crisis. And there is empirical evidence that this green growth solution doesn't really add up. We've been trying green growth for the last 30 years. We know that it's pretty much impossible to decouple economic growth from environmental destruction in a speed that would be necessary. That's why we need to change the economy, and that's why we today talk about post-growth economies. The second starting point is that globally speaking, our modern way of life that we're living in the West is dependent on the exploitation of the people in the global South, mostly of migrant workers, care workers, and a lot of other marginalized communities. And the third starting point is that in order to change this, we cannot be fighting capitalism alone as a structure. We cannot be only talking about changing the economic system, but we also have to talk about changing the culture, what we even perceive, or how do we measure quality of life, what is it? And this is where I'm really interested to hear our guests today to speak about these cultural changes, because even in the degrowth debates, we talk about policies a lot, but actually it's not only about changing politics, it's also about changing humans and how they proceed or what they aspire in their lives. How do they see progress? What even is progress in this time? And so it's my real pleasure to be inviting the guest speakers, and I hope that they'll be on the screen very soon. And first of all, it's important to say that you have, or it's been promoted that Shaun Chamberlin is going to join this discussion, and unfortunately we haven't been able to reach him now. So he might be joining in. He might be joining in throughout the discussion. Like, I don't know, we're going to improvise if that happens, but he's not with us right now. But more importantly, the people who are with us, and you can see them on the screen now, and that's, first of all, Max Koch, who is a Swedish sociologist and professor of social policy and sustainability at the Lund University. And he's really one of the leading figures in the post-growth, degrowth research. What he really focuses on is this also idea of actually getting rid of some of the drivers for growth at the level of the state. One of the books that he co-published with Milana Buchs is called Post-Growth and Well-Being, Challenges to Sustainable Welfare, which I believe is also one of the reasons why he's been invited to the debate today. And then the next two speakers are Miki Kashtan, who has really Miki Kashtan, firstly, who has been really influential for me in the last couple of years. I would describe her as a really active, really proactive visionary with a strong vision. She's really interested in these ideas of nonviolence and what does it mean to live nonviolence deeply, and also how to change the structures of our economy, of the way we relate to each other, that would hold this ideal of nonviolence dear. She's written several books. The first one, or the one I've read, I'm going to mention those. I haven't read all of them, I'm sorry. Spinning Threads of Radical Aliveness, Transcending the Legacy of Separation in Our Individual Lives. And then the second book is called Reviving Our Human Fabric, Working Together to Create a Nonviolent Future. This book, I'm really happy to announce that has been translated into Czech language, at least half of it. It's called Svět nenásilí, and I have forgotten it in the back, but I do have some here, so in case you're interested in what Emma and Miki talk about, then you could get the book from me after the debate. And then also, and I really like how Miki described it in the email, she was saying she really wanted to also Emma is the second speaker today that will be representing this perspective of the nonviolence and how is it connected to degrowth or this future that we want to be good for all. And Miki said part of shifting the culture in the ways that we're going to talk about in this debate is to move away from leaning on one person only. Right? That we have these debates where there's only one person and it's super stressful for them to speak about all of this. So today it will be both of them responding to the questions. And Emma is a founding member of Nonviolent Global Liberation community and has been applying and experimenting with the framework of nonviolence since 2017. And she's been really developing this sort of a tool that's called vision mobilization, which, how would I sum it up? It's like, how do we hold our values dear and move towards the vision that we have for the future world from the point today? How do we don't reproduce the same structures and patterns of behavior thinking that have caused the problems in the first place? So yeah, welcome all three of you at the debate. And now we can start. And my first question is going to go to Max, because when we're going to talk about the quality of life in the post-growth world, it's important to point out that increasing the quality of life in the last centuries in the Western world has really gone hand in hand with the growth of our economies and with increase of our material and energy consumption. And in the degrowth circles, we often criticize so-called imperial mode of living that we're living in. And at the same time, we draw this ideal of like a good life that's not necessarily exploitative. So to start of this debate, I would really like you to start with maybe elaborating on these two concepts of imperial mode of living and on a good life that would be accessible for all. And yeah, and we'll move from there.
Well, let me first thank you so much for the invitation. I think this is definitely the first time I'm talking at a film festival, so that's a great honor. I'm a documentary film festival, so and I think it is great that you reach out also to wider societal debates, and of course especially about degrowth. So thanks so much for having me. And the concept of the imperial mode of living has been coined by two Germans. Uli Brandt is one, and the other is called Markus Wissen. As far as I know, the concept basically alludes to basically continuity of kind of something that is similar to imperialism, in the sense that the inequalities between North and South, the northern the countries of the global North and those of the global South continue to be unequal. In the what is usually referred to as the golden age of capitalism, specifically in Western Europe, that is after the Second World War to the 1970s, these were the years of very fast and high growth rates, which in turn made sure that the incomes of capital and labor grew in parallel, and because that was the case, the third institution was also happy, about which we will talk later. That was the state, basically taxing the primary incomes of capital and labor to basically finance and set up the welfare state and the welfare systems, about which we will also hear later. So this particular constellation led to a kind of full employment, basically for the male employees, but later also for women. It was a time where material standards of living expanded and increased. But already then, that was dependent on the extraction of resources from other parts of the world, and both in terms of material resources from nature and especially energy. So, which made these so-called golden epoch of capitalism not generalizable from the beginning to the world. In other words, had all people on the planet had comparable lifestyles than Westerners had between 1950s and the 1970s, we would have ended up in an acute climate emergency significantly earlier. And even so, this is often described also as kind of the Fordist way of socialization, which was aggravated, of course, by the Cold War at the time. It's kind of a competition basically between who could eat more meat, basically, yeah, and who, but also who had more holidays and whose social insurance system was better. Of course, that changed when the Cold War was over. And basically competition and the flexible modes of capitalism became much more the order of the day, so that capitalism became much less pleasant to live in, even within the areas of the global North. But basically, and this is what this a concept of the imperial mode of living alludes to, is that just as in the colonial times or in the imperialist times, which is sometimes said to have stopped somewhere around the First World War, basically our relatively high material levels of living are directly and indirectly connected to much poorer living conditions in the global south, and also an over-exploitation of their resources, which brings the degrowth community, not least thanks to the introduction that Tadeáš has done. There's no decoupling of GDP growth and environmental resource parameters to question the growth paradigm in itself and look out for different ways of understanding well-being and welfare, this time within planetary limits, and of course on comparator limits in global north and global south countries. So degrowth is from the beginning also a critique of colonialism and imperialism.
And then maybe to add on, so you have described really well the imperial mode of living, and now I'm interested in this good life. And how do we actually, how do we even think about it, in terms of maybe, you're a scientist, in terms of measurements, or what kind of concepts can actually we use to look at this good life, which should be the alternative towards imperial mode of living?
Yeah, I have so far more talked about what the degrowth camp is basically in agreement on, but in terms of what how we should measure, how we should understand well-being, well, there are also some different ideas. So some emphasize subjective well-being, so kind of the happiness that is usually measured on a bounded scale from 1 to 10, basically asking people, how happy are you after all? And then you find that especially in the Nordic countries, you have quite high levels of happiness. Actually, in all of these Western countries, you have significantly higher levels of happiness than in the rest of the world. Well, you mentioned the book that I've written with Milena Büchs. We are a bit critical of that because sometimes the argument is made that, okay, we see that subjective well-being levels have not increased in countries such as the US and other Western countries since about the 1950s, despite the fact that GDP growth has been going on the whole time. So that is often referred to as the Easterlin paradox. So then the argument is often made that, well, that means that GDP wealth is not at all linked to subjective happiness. But that is something we don't really know how that would basically develop if we really took about 50% or so of the GDP away, had less wealth to distribute. The only thing we know is what happens in recessions, and there we, like in Russia, for example, in the 1990s or after the 2008 financial crisis, there we actually had reductions of subjective well-being. And then, of course, we say that is not our degrowth, such recessions, but the truth is we do not have empirical material about this because we didn't have any degrowth cases to study so far empirically. An alternative is, and that's something that Milena Büchs and I tend to favor, is to look at objective standards of living. That is, for example, or specifically theories of human need. That is an idea that there is there's a catalog of human needs, and there's basically two theories, one by Doyle and Goff and one by Max Neef, and you find that there are something like 10 to 12 kind of general human needs that have to be met. Otherwise, people experience what Ian Goff calls serious harm. So reproduction of our mental and physical body and soul is necessary, is dependent on the satisfaction of these needs. The needs approach has the advantage, we think, because it allows a kind of even though that sounds a bit of science fiction, a dialogue with future generations. Because if needs as such are seen as a kind of constant over time and actually across space too, then we can at least assume that future generations will also have a need for example, clean water and breathable air, which could be interpreted in terms that we have to make sure that appropriate need satisfiers are delivered also for those who come after us. So whilst needs as such are seen as constant or largely constant over time and space, need satisfiers are not. They are they vary with a local, cultural, and social context, and that is what we think makes the needs approach amenable to degrowth and sustainable welfare debates.
Thanks a lot. So yeah, you're saying that basically looking at the needs, which are kind of universal, that even though people have their specific ways of meeting these needs might be different, then the needs are sort of universal. And I think that's maybe where it really also connects to the work of Miki and Emma, who are working with nonviolent communication and approaches which really work with these needs approach as well. So here, and at the same time, you have mentioned that these strategies of meeting our needs actually change maybe across geographic regions or historically. Miki and Emma, you work a lot on how sort of this patriarchal and capitalist conditioning makes us meet some of our needs in certain ways. And then also maybe in this way, reproduces the imperial mode of living rather than aiming towards the good life as we defined it before. So maybe the question for you two is, could you talk a little bit about this more, like this, what is the conditioning? And it also connects with these ideas of human nature, because a lot of people say utopia of degrowth will never happen because people are selfish and will never, work together and stuff like this. So from your perspective, how can we look at this? How can we look at going more towards the good life and maybe changing our conditioning from the past?
So I'll respond something first, and then Miki might add something. What comes to me to say is that we live on an interdependent planet. Like, we are actually connected to each other. Like what we go and buy from the shop, for instance, comes from someone who has grown that and from a place where that has been grown. All the things that we have are connected to other places. Everything that we do is connected to somewhere else. We do actually live interdependently. We are on one planet. I know we probably know this, but like actually truly knowing it and living from that place is something that we don't do. How we hold what we are holding is that this knowledge of deep interdependence is something that we lost trust in what we call the patriarchal turn. So when we lose that trust, essentially we lose trust in life, because life is what is creating all of the things that we have. And when we have trust in life's capacity to actually create, then we can kind of lean into it. And we don't need to make things happen. But when we lose that trust, it's like then we think we need to start making things happen. We start kind of forcing. These are the structures that we live in, our structures of force-based narratives. Like I can't remember the ones you mentioned at the start. Tadeáš, is it Tadeáš? Is that how you say your name? Tadeáš? Yeah.
Yes.
What were some of the narratives you said? What was the first narrative you said?
Imperial.
Business as usual was
Oh,
the
yeah.
first narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, so like business as usual, this is all we've got. We have to sort of make it work with what we have. This is the best that we can do. These are all narratives that are based in a lack of trust in life. And what I would say is that we don't actually know what the good life, as you call it, could be. Measurements of happiness even are based within patriarchal capitalist structures. We don't actually know on a big scale what it would be like to live within those interdependent webs, and the sort of happiness, the sort of flow that would exist between people if we were actually connected in that way. Yeah, that's a piece.
Okay.
Do you want to say anything else?
Oh yeah, I want to, first of all, you mentioned Max Neef, and you, Max, mentioned another Max. I forgot, Manfred Max Neef. And I'm not sure if you know of his work about the threshold hypothesis, which is very much related to growth and well-being. And the hypothesis is that you need to grow the GDP up to a point to increase well-being. Beyond that point, you can push the GDP no matter how much you will push it up. It will not add to well-being, and it might even decrease it. And in his theory, Europe and North America went through this peak in the 70s and 80s, and now one country after another in Asia is going through it. And each time that people go through it, that a country goes through it, it happens at a lower GDP level, which is one way of looking at the imperial mode, that we are still, those of us living in the global north, are still stealing from the global south, even the possibility of improving well-being through GDP by constraining the environment to the degree that we do. That's one thing I wanted to add from before. Another is, I think there is an example of a country that went through rapid, involuntary degrowth and did remarkably well, if you look at it from within its own terms, and that is Cuba. They lost the support of the Soviet Union when the Cold War ended and needed to find a kind of self-reliance that succeeded because they have solidarity. A lot of poverty there is pretty high. It's also the highest literacy in all of Latin America. So if you start measuring things differently from within the terms of interdependence that Emma mentioned, then suddenly what is the good life changes from material to non-material elements. You need some baseline. Beyond that, the material is immaterial. Another piece that I wanted to bring is what Tadeáš mentioned, this idea that people are selfish. And one of the classic versions of that is the so-called tragedy of the commons. And I want to just bring in that it has now been proven that commons actually work, unlike what Hardin said. Commons work, and they work exactly in the context that Emma mentioned, when there is a community that knows itself as a community, that engages with the resources that exist in a way that is oriented to needs and well-being rather than to maximizing anything. And those work over hundreds and thousands of years. So I no longer remember the question, and if there's anything that we haven't covered, please let us know and we can add.
Yeah, maybe it connects to what Emma spoke about, that we have lost this trust in the interdependence,
Yes.
in the flow of life, and we, in a
Yes.
way, are maybe more separated and believe that we can, satisfy our own needs, and, according to the economic theory, let's say that's the best way how we help the planet, that we are
Yes.
selfish, right? So
Thank you.
I'm
I
interested.
know.
Okay.
No, I know what I wanted to add, which is that when we lose trust in life, the logical thing to do is to accumulate, because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and is anybody going to be there, and is there going to be enough? And once you start with accumulation, it disrupts the very, very delicate flow that otherwise happens in life, that in non-human life is still happening, but humans interfered with it. So I see it, our task in terms of restoring the good life is to restore trust in life, so that we can engage with each other for the collective optimal satisfaction of needs within the means available to us, including mourning when there isn't enough, which does sometimes happen. So that was the piece I wanted to add. Thank you.
Maybe to have a follow-up question, though, because I get it, like it sounds nice to trust in the interdependence, etc., and not accumulate. But then at the same time, that's really, I think, difficult. And I would really like to hear maybe more specific examples of how to rebuild this trust, right? Because, for instance, even in our NGO, we are trying to like work with money in a different way. But there's always this like, okay, what if I don't get now, and in the future I move somewhere else? And I won't have the community around me, right? Like they won't be able to support me if I don't live in the place where I'm living with them, with the community now. So how do you rebuild this trust, which I think, as you said, is really lost? Like people don't believe in each other that much, or in the fact that they'll be taken care of in the future if they don't accumulate.
So we are part of a community. You mentioned it, the Nonviolent Global Liberation Community. And there are now about 30 of us, maybe a little more, who are bound to each other in a bond of shared risk. All the money that comes into the community/organization is distributed amongst us based on need. Some of us have no other source of income. Some other people have some other sources of income. And so we make very different requests. It's unrelated to how much we work. It is only related to how much we need. And that network right now is like a tiny micro seed of a global gift economy, because it spans 3 continents and multiple countries and people in multiple setups, some in families, some of us are in shared risk pods, some of us are individuals. And it's working. It's been working for a few years now, and it's only getting better. So I can see that if you have good enough agreements and begin from we're going to make it work, then it works. And we can now teach others how to do it if they want to do that, either locally or interdependence over global regions.
Thanks a lot. I also received an information now that Shaun is actually with us, or has been with us for a while, so maybe let's have him on the screen. Hi, Shaun.
Hi, Tadeáš. Apologies. Yes, I've been listening in for about 25 minutes, and my apologies for the delay.
Cool. You were here not in the beginning, so yeah, we were just framing the debate in this like quality of life in the post-growth world, right? When growth is no longer happening. And so maybe the first question from me to you would be about maybe this quality of life, because I know you have been working really closely with David Fleming, an economic historian, who's done some profound work on culture and how is culture connected to economy and stuff. So I would really like to have maybe more of this historical perspective of how is the quality of life in the past, maybe what can it tell us about the quality of life in the post-growth future? And now I know that there has been like technological changes that we use all of the more materials, et cetera, but I'm interested more in terms of this post-growth culture where maybe we can draw some lessons from history.
Sure. I mean, I'd really echo what Emma and Miki were just saying. You know, it's so much about relationships and trust, and I'll explain a little more what I mean by that. So you mentioned a little earlier this sort of critique, like the utopia of degrowth will never happen. You know, it's this idealized thing. I would make the case that we're at a point in history where radical change is absolutely inevitable. You know, we're kind of trained maybe by the mainstream to think that the mainstream is so huge and powerful, and that, you know, we're just tinkering around the edges and we'll never be able to overthrow it. And actually, the way I see it is that the mainstream is teetering on the brink of collapse. We're in a situation where, well, there's a Chinese saying, we either change direction or we end up where we're headed. And where we're headed looks nothing like today, and radically changing direction looks nothing like today. So radical change is coming. And for me, the question is, how do we steer that? How do we influence that radical change to happen in really valuable ways, rather than trying to sort of instigate it? And, you know, we're often told, you know, you're asking for the historical perspective. We're often told not to romanticize the past, right? For me, the much greater danger today is romanticizing the future. Where we are headed is not looking pretty at all. And what's leading us there is this idea that we should seek our security for the future as individuals, as communities, as nations, even in money. Like, that's the dominant story. Like, if you want to have a secure future, you need to have savings and a pension and a mortgage even. And so, as you say, if we look to history, if we look to the history of how did societies exist and thrive for the millennia before we came into this kind of money-based, growth-based culture. I mean, depending on where you draw the line, it's only really been around 200 or 300 years. I mean, money itself has only been around 4,000 or 5,000 years. I mean, you know, Homo sapiens has existed for 200,000 or 300,000 years. So these are the new interlopers. The idea of money and growth being the basis of our security. And when you do look before those things at how societies existed and thrived, they were based in two things: not money, but the natural world, obviously, like, which actually supplies all our wealth, ultimately, all our food and water and oxygen even, and relationships and trust, what David Fleming calls the informal economy. These are the economies that support life, ultimately. And we need to get away from this kind of illusion that money is the thing. And, you know, there's this lovely saying that movements build at the speed of trust. And I think the future we need to build can only be built at the speed of trust. And this is really, I mean, I don't want to go on too long in my first contribution, but this is really what David Fleming's work is all about, is looking to, as you say, culture and community and conviviality as not only the basis for our future, but also as having been the basis for past economies. Really, it's about building the sequels to our present society, because as I've just said, we like to think that the choice is between how we live now and, you know, these radical futures that people like Miki or whoever are talking about, or Max. But that is not the choice. There is no choice that looks like continuing as we currently are, because it's unsustainable. And somehow everyone agrees that our current way of life is unsustainable, but somehow we seem to forget that means it's going to end, even though that's literally what unsustainable means. So yeah, really the only alternative is rebuilding these relationships of trust, these communities, because the mainstream is disappearing, and that's always been the only alternative to it. And the joy in that, the wonder of that, is that that's actually how we want to live. You know, that's actually what we miss every day, right? Is that why are we all living in this atomized way? Why does nobody have friendships and relationships that mean anything? It's because we have this perception that we don't really need each other. You know, what we really need is money. Like, it's all very nice to hang out with our friends, but fundamentally, you know, it's money that we really need. And that is the lie, I think, that has driven us to this point of collapse. And that when you speak to people who've existed through financial collapses, who've seen when the security in money shows the illusory nature of it, what we fall back on, and we all know this on a personal level when we fall on financial hard times, what we fall back on immediately is relationships and the natural world, because that's what's actually real. And so, yeah, really, it's about rebuilding our relationships and our trust-based economies, and rebuilding and restoring and supporting the natural world. And that, I think, is the work that Emma and Miki are doing. It's the work that we do here at our gift-based community around the Happy Pig. It's the work that the transition movement that I've been very involved with globally is doing. It's really about rediscovering a life in which the grimness of capitalism falls away a little. This kind of desperate urgency of needing to spend all our time creating money because we need money in order to have a place to exist, because we need money in order to feed ourselves. And as David Fleming poetically put it, it's about recreating a world again in which there's time for music. Because it's in that world that we rediscover what culture is in a sense for. And what culture is for is rebuilding those relationships that allow people to exist and thrive together in the absence of things like full-time employment and economic growth. And yeah, maybe I'll stop there for the moment, Tadeáš.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's really interesting, actually, that, we were talking about heading towards good life, which should have less material footprint and energy costs, etc. And we start moving not about, I don't know, some technologies, but actually about like getting back to the like cultural stuff, and how rebuilding trust is a really, really big part of it, which I think in today sustainability circles we don't talk about as much. We maybe talk more about trusting or not trusting the market rather than trusting each other. We were talking on maybe now on a really like this community level, building trust, going into this flow, not accumulating. And also several times you have mentioned like money as an issue. Now I have a question for Max, because we know that the states, the way they function today, really require growth, for their stability, is also in terms of money, the way the money is being made as debt, which needs to be repaid with interest. That is one of the constant drivers for further growth. And you're kind of an expert on this field of sustainable welfare, and how do we actually have a welfare state without growth, or a social state. So I'm wondering if you could also shine the light on what does this change toward post-growth living means in terms of restructuring how the state today works, or is it even possible to do it with states around still?
Oh, well, thanks for the difficult question. I have actually started to think about the state in degrowth transformation, because I came across that much green thinking, including degrowth thinking, is basically absolutely against the state, in the sense that the state is identified with a bureaucratic apparatus which kind of needs to be abolished before we can actually go anywhere. So that is, of course, the short version of it. And this has led to rather passionate discussions, for example, at the Degrowth conference in Malmö in 2018, which I co-organized. And it brought me to look at some of the state theories, which are a bit older, and to reread them in the degrowth circumstances. So I looked at people like Poulantzas, Gramsci, and Bourdieu from this perspective, and I did that because I think it is rather unlikely that the state will, as Marx called it, wither away in the kind of rather short period of time we have at the disposal, basically, to save us, which leaves us with the whether we like it or not alternative, but to also work through the state to carry out the kind of changes we want to see. And I don't go so much in the theory, but these three people I just mentioned, they all open up for, at least in democratic circumstances, the state being something that is also co-produced by civil society movements. That it is not only basically in the interest of the dominated class, but also it has to make compromises of some kind, institutional kind. So to make it very short, if enough bottom-up pressure from civil society could be produced, the state could be kind of reoriented towards doing some of the things we would like to see. Well, the historical example of that would be, of course, the rise of the welfare state, which was kind of an in many ways you could call it a compromise between the classes of the capital owners and those who sold their labor power, the workers. No? And so it's something that was rather unprecedented at the time, and it's something that people got kind of accustomed to. So even though there are different welfare systems and welfare regimes, still there is a kind of a minimum level that allows people to live without having to sell their labor power, at least for a time. Temporarily. That means in cases of sickness, of unemployment, and old age, for example, and so that is something that a lot of people will want to preserve, and I think we need now to find answers. And here we are really in the beginning. So I'm coming here with more questions than answers. It is one of the probably quite important strategic questions, how we can basically finance welfare systems, maintain, and I say welfare systems because they don't necessarily have to take the form of the state, but nevertheless we have to make sure that these basic services I was just talking about, basically meeting the risks of unemployment, sickness, and old age, and a lot of others, so that people can basically survive. And we have, I think, only started to think about welfare systems in the absence of economic growth. We have a project in Lund looking into this, but we are still in the beginning. We can quite surely say that the welfare systems we have at the moment in Western countries anyway are quite tightly linked to the provision of economic growth, which is what makes us to, at least for the time being, demand a different form of taxation to not end up in budget disasters right in the first year or so of a degrowth transition. So away from labor, more towards wealth. And we have seen wealth taxation basically decreasing over 30 years now or so. So one of the things when I came to Sweden was, for example, that I was quite surprised. There's no inheritance tax in Sweden. So basically, it's a bit like in the 19th century. If you're born rich, and then you stay rich. I mean, if you still want to work, then it's more of a hobby. You don't do it because you have to do it, and these kind of things. So and Sweden is actually one of the most unequal societies in the whole OECD area when it comes to wealth inequality, and. But this is only an extreme example, but it gives you an indication of where we probably would need to think about. So within degrowth, we have and sustainable welfare. We are thinking that we should, on the one hand, target basically the rich, also because of their far outsized ecological footprint. That can be via a stronger wealth taxation, but also a cap on income and wealth in general, that beyond a certain income, basically the state in this case would tax 100% in order to, for example, finance the for example, renewable energy, but also making sure that sufficiency levels for all basically are maintained, whether people can work or not. Basically, a certain minimum income or certain basic services must be provided, as I tried to outline in the beginning. So this comes probably quite close to what Kate Raw was, for example, outlines in terms of a just and safe operating space, taking into account both the planetary limits at the top and the social limits that we would translate with need satisfaction, minimum need satisfaction levels at the lower end.
Thanks a lot on how to actually approach this state without growth and what might be some of the policy measures to move forward, like in that direction of actually having some kind of basic provisioning, but then without the continuation of economic growth. When I look at the time, I think I have the possibility to pose the last question. So it's going to go to Miki and Emma, because I know that you're working, you yourself are experimenting with a lot of these new approaches in terms of rebuilding trust among yourselves, but you're also facilitators who are helping with this sort of endeavor to other activist communities who are like trying to bring about change, right? Like Miki, I know you were part of the Occupy movement. I've heard that you were helping this community, Tamara, in Portugal. And I'm interested in the ways that we as activists maybe still reproduce the same patterns that have put us into this place of ecological collapse, huge inequality, and stuff like this, because I often find myself reproducing some of them. So I'm wondering, from your experience, what are the most common patterns that the people trying to reach a different future reproduce, and how can we work with those, or how can we liberate us and actually start creating new patterns that are gonna bring us closer to the future that we desire?
One of the patterns that I can think of is like continuing to force ourselves to do things. So it's like we know that we want this other world to exist, for instance, and maybe we're working in activism in some way, or some other way of trying to bring this world into being, but we're still actually forcing ourselves to work, or needing to like sacrifice ourselves in some way for the creation of what we're trying to create. And this can lead to burnout, or resentment, where I may be putting more energy in than this person next to me, and we're in judgment of each other for that. So this is one pattern that's going to reproduce that like force mechanism. And so one thing that we're working with, which Miki mentioned earlier in relation to the gift economy experiment that we have, is that within NGL, we only do what we can do out of willingness, and that there is actually energy for. Also within purpose, it's not like people just do what they want and then they drop it if there's no energy for it anymore, then I just pull out. It's caring for the purpose together within togetherness. So we're trying to create a way of knowing together what our actual energy and willingness is to do things, while at the same time being vocal about where that energy is and where it isn't, so that, and what our needs are behind us making those choices to do things or not do things, so that other people can actually orient and we can hold something together within the energy that's there, rather than trying to force it. And this is also where needs awareness is important, because like in the structures that we live within at the moment, resources flow to where there are already resources in existence. So like where people have money to buy things and there's demand for things, is where resources flow to. If people have need, like we all do, but there isn't money, then resources generally don't flow in that direction. So we're experimenting with shifting this so that when needs are expressed, the resources actually flow based on needs, because this is where the power needs to come from when we're living within community, is resources flowing towards needs rather than to where there is like money to be able to pay for things. So that's two things. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that we are not perfect. The thing that you said, Tadeáš, is spot on. And one of the things that I long for is spaces where movements and communities can talk about where they struggle, where they don't live up to their values, where the capacity is lower than the need, and that we can co-hold our dilemmas instead of always putting on like a bright thing. Oh, we already figured out this piece and all of that. So we are a completely imperfect community, and we are quite transparent about where we struggle and where we don't. That's one of the things that I really value about us. And I want to mention two specific places where we struggle a lot, and they're related to each other. And it's related to needs in this way. When a baby is born, a baby has a natural flow of following their own ideas. They're not coming as ideas, their own impulses, their own spurt of, I want this, I want this. Socialization coerces us out of what we want. So we lose track of what we want. We lose track of the capacity to translate what we want into action. That is directly through patriarchal socialization. And it results in pervasive disempowerment. We don't trust that our needs matter because we have hard evidence from our own life and from looking around us that just having a need doesn't do anything. So taking on the risk and the power to say, I'm here, I want something, I want to make something happen, it is very lacking. And still, even though we're taking a lot of energy to work on liberation of ourselves and supporting each other's liberation, there is still tremendous amount of disempowerment where people don't initiate, don't do, and don't make things happen, wait for other people to do them. Just like daddy will take care of it or the state will take care of it, whichever it is. And then what happens is when people step into leadership to take action and to make things happen, then there's a lot of criticism. So the two things coincide, and I know this is pervasive in all movements, that when people step into leadership, and I want to add, especially if they're female, there's a lot of criticism and undermining and challenging that happens. So we're dealing with that and we're getting better at it, but these are some of the patterns, and it is directly related to lack of trust that I matter, lack of trust that other people will care. Those two are dramatic obstacles on the path to the actual possibility of living in relationship with each other and with life as it is, insufficiency for all.
Thanks a lot. Even though I would love to be asking you questions for another hours, I need to give the option to do this to the audience. So let's have a look at the time. But I think, yeah, we do have around 20 minutes for questions. So whoever has a question, I believe, is there some like microphone that can circulate, or how does it actually work? Yeah, there is. Perfect. So yeah, there seems to be a first question over there. And actually, we might be collecting just for a little second. We might be collecting 2 questions at a time to speed up also the response process. And yeah, so let's hear the first question, and then there's, I see Maya there in the back, so that will be the other question. Mm-hmm.
Dobré odpoledne, jsem Tomáš Krásenský, ročník 64 a o životní prostředí se prakticky i teoreticky
So I am very
zajímám
interested
od roku
in
1984.
environment since 1994. I've been working in environmental studies and I have questions for all five of you.
Prosím, jenom už tam slyším množné číslo, tak aby mělo víc lidí možnost se ptát, tak poprosím,
Well,
zkusit zredukovat na jednu otázku.
we will have more questions, so please just pose one question. Yes, during communism, I've read in Marx and Stalin and everything. Are you communists?
A pak ještě otázka vzadu.
And then we have another question.
Aha, tak už je tam mikrofon.
So I have a follow-up question for Miki Kashtan. I wanted to ask, it's okay, so we're now building little self-sufficient communities, but ultimately we want to build a mass movement. So we can also integrate there people who do not come with this specific social capital and do not end up in our specific bubble. So I wanted to ask, how can we build a mass movement but on a principle that allow us to practice degrowth philosophy. So how to make this mass movement wholesome so we don't burn out. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. You do have the translation of the first question, or? Yeah, you do. Perfect. So yeah, then maybe I guess this question specifically was directed to all of us, all of you. I guess everybody can respond, maybe starting with Shaun. So the question was like, are you Marxists? So then Shaun, Max, then Miki, Emma, and then we'll move on to the second question that is specifically to Miki and Emma.
Just a second, I'm not clear on the question because in the translation it said communist, not Marxist, and these are actually different things, and I want to know what was actually meant.
I even forgot now as well. So it was communists. Okay, good. Thanks for the clarification, that's important. So yeah, Shaun, go ahead. And mic on, ideally.
Sorry. I'm no expert on communism, so I think I'm going to leave that particular element of that answer to others who can speak much more clearly to whether that's a label that fits. But I think the fundamental critique that I have of capitalism, let's say, I mean, Max talked about the situation of, the rich staying rich, and that, working becomes a hobby. And I think when we think about the rich, what we tend to think about of them as is financially independent. They're in this very comfortable situation where working is a hobby, they can do what they want. And I think right at the heart of our culture, right at the heart of our upbringings as individuals, is this idea that financial independence is like our first obligation. If we're not financially independent, then we're a parasite, we're a sponge, we're relying on the government or on daddy or on our friends or whoever it may be. And I would argue that is the real fundamental cultural thing we need to shift, because financial independence doesn't actually even exist. Like, even the richest people in the world, they didn't grow their own food, they didn't build their own house. They're still dependent on someone else who did those things for them. They're still dependent on the natural world that ultimately produced this wealth. So even being incredibly rich doesn't make you independent. It just allows you to be dependent on people you don't know instead of being dependent on people you do know. And that's why it's often very lonely. In fact, that's why it's often quite a miserable state. I mean, you hear stories of people, the mega wealthy, who haven't been physically touched in a year, because you don't touch rich people. I mean, this is miserable. And yet this is what we're urged by our society to spend our whole lives striving to achieve, this miserable fate. We give the bulk of our hours, of the best years of our lives, to working for money to try and achieve this financial independence. And there's a wonderful quote by the long dead economist Thorsten Veblen, who said there is a leisure class at both ends of the economic spectrum. And personally, I decided to try and aim to be in the leisure class at the other end of the economic spectrum. And I decided to minimize my dependence on money, to live on as little money as I possibly could. And that freed me up. That's what's allowed me to do all these interesting things with the last 15, 20 years of my life, because I haven't had to worry about earning money to exist. I've built my life on relationships, on the gift economy. I live in a place where I have strong relationships and where I'm welcome, and I move around a lot. And I won't talk too much about my lifestyle, but really the key for me has been learning to minimize my dependency on money so that I could step outside of the mainstream system and build my life more directly on the things that we're really reliant on, which is, again, relationships with human beings and relationships with the natural world. And I'll let the others say whether that makes me a communist or not.
I think Max was next up.
Well, if the question is if I'm a communist, then probably no, especially if you identify communism with the kind of regime that dominated Eastern Europe after the Second World War. But if you ask me whether Marx has something to say to these concerns, then I would say yes, he does. Because he was in the 19th century. At this time, he was very much basically looking at the work of natural scientists, and he took from people like Justus Liebig and others basically the concept of metabolism, that basically the interaction between human beings and nature is basically at the core of his analysis of capitalism, which starts with looking at the commodity and use value and exchange value. So I don't know whether that helps, but I would actually recommend reading Marx in the original, because I think there's a lot you can learn, including about day-to-day capitalism.
Thanks a lot. And now Miki and Emma, and also maybe after you respond to this first question, you can respond to the second one that I believe was connected to building the social movement within the principles you talk about, to like enlarge it also with the kind of people that are not necessarily in our class or don't have the same social capital.
So I recently wrote an article called "Why Capitalism Cannot Be Redeemed." It's posted on Medium, you can find it. I collected 43 reasons in about 7 or 8 categories. And the very end of that article, I talk about how the polarity, the opposition, the either or of, we either have capitalism or we have communism, and that's all there is, that in itself is a problem. I think that there are things to learn from each of the systems, and there are things to reject about both of them. And fundamentally, even though capitalists would like to imagine that the state doesn't exist and they don't want government interference, capitalism absolutely and completely depends on there being a strong state. Countries where there is a weak state, capitalism cannot thrive there. And a strong state, and I will go back to the original thinking about state. A state, what it is characterized by is being the only legitimate user of violence. That is not a radical definition. That comes to Max Weber. It doesn't get more mainstream than Max Weber. And so that means we are putting our needs into the hands of an entity that says, basically, if you don't follow my rules, I am willing to resort to violence to enforce them. This is my fundamental critique of the state. So communism is completely state-bound. Capitalism is completely state-bound. And I believe that we can create a globally coordinated, locally owned and distributed system of global gift economy where all things can flow from where they exist to where they're needed without requiring state mechanisms. I'm not saying we know how to get there. I know it's possible. I have it fully worked out. And I think all the mechanisms of transportation are in existence. The only variable that needs to change is money. If you take money out of the equation, and you really look at requests and offers and what is available based on need, and develop sophisticated algorithms for quantifying needs, for quantifying purpose, for quantifying capacity. All the mechanisms, the technology is already in place. I think I can jump from there to the other question and then pass it to the others, which is, I think one slogan that I have some hope can catalyze a movement that I came up with is quit the market. And I think that quit the market is something that is not a binary thing. You're in the market or you're out. Just like the constructive program spinning wheel that Gandhi did, it's something that people can choose 30 minutes a day. What can I do to rely on the market less today? Even if it's a small thing like cooking a meal rather than going and buying a ready-made meal, inviting friends over for dinner rather than going out to a restaurant. It can be very small things, but it reduces our dependence on the market. And anything we can do in that way, I think that is a simple enough thing that with people who know how to organize can become a mass movement. Want to add anything?
No, don't have anything to add.
Okay, so more questions. I see one hand up over there. So if the microphone, I don't know where it is. And is there somebody else? Right next, that's handy.
Yeah, is it oh, it's working now. Okay. Thank you for your ideas. I was quite intrigued by the fact that your community actually spans 3 continents, and it got me kind of asking, like, how does the infrastructure work, and how dependent are you on, you know, like Google or a huge, basically these huge digital companies which facilitate the connection between people over continents?
Thanks. And then the next question right next to you.
Dobrý den, já bych rád položil v češtině, abych se vyjádřil.
Good afternoon.
Já jsem možná neporozuměl jedné věci.
Perhaps I didn't quite understand one thing.
Jak prakticky ze současného stavu
based on the current state of the northern world, which is governed by rules of liberal democracy, let's say. How can we get into such a society that you are describing here without disrupting the democracy? Do you believe that these ideas you are talking about will be voted for in free elections by the majority?
Perfect. So I think the first question was really directly was going to Miki and Emma. And then the second one maybe I would point to Max, who I believe like there was some research also about this policy proposal and their like popular success, or how much would people support policies like maximum income. And then I see that Shaun wants to speak to that too. So the first question to Emma about the infrastructure and how much you rely on these global giants, and then we'll move from there.
So at the moment, yeah, we are relying on Google and Zoom mainly. I think that's the main two that we rely on. And we are in a process, yes, so we rely on Google for infrastructure because all of our work is online. We're an online community. That's how we're able to span 3 continents. Although we're also forming on the ground communities. They're starting to appear. So we use Google for that infrastructure. And we are in a gradual process of what we call untethering from the market and state-based structures. So for instance, we're now untethering from banks, essentially. And so all of our, like the money that comes in, which is by gift from people that are gifting to us was coming in and going through organizations and basically through one organization that has been distributed from there. And what we're in the process of doing now is that organization is closing, and we are distributing these funds between individuals who are what we call storehouses. And we have multiples of these, which creates a much more resilient structure. It also relies on a much more relationship between those people and us. And it also means that those people are like intrinsically connected to what we're doing because they're a part of it. They're no longer just like supporting from the outside in some way. They're a part of the resources actually moving, which creates a lot more energy of like being a part of something. So it generates energy also to hold resources within relationships in a way that is beyond the money itself. Yeah.
I also want to add that it's very clear to me that if we continue right now, we are about 300 people, of whom about 10% are active. And that's a very, very small number. If we grow beyond this in a significant way, eventually it's very clear to me that we will need to create our own alternative technology so that we're not relying on technology giants, and so that we have potentially community-based, globally interconnected projects using technologies that are yet to be created. I think the technologies might be created using people, technologically savvy people who come together. But it never ends. There's fiber optic. The fiber optic cables are used by everyone. That actually is already technology that is, in my understanding, totally distributed. It's very hard to monitor in any kind of way. That's what has enabled things like WhatsApp and Skype and all of this to make free calling. So it's very, very complex. And I agree with the question that until we are free from the technological infrastructure that is dominated by capitalist giants, we are still beholden to the market to some degree, however gradually diminishing it will be.
Thanks. So let's move to the second question, which was about the popularity of this kind of change or transformation and how to do it in a democratic fashion. I hope I'm not misinterpreting.
First of all, I want to say I'm very grateful for this question, which is of course absolutely crucial. I can say that the degrowth movement is committed to democratic means. We have started to look a bit into the popularity of what we call eco-social policies. For example, the maximum income would be one in Sweden, and then we find that one thing for labor time reduction that is quite popular. Also wealth taxation. Maximum income was less popular. It was something like 25% or so. But there you have to say that this is an idea that absolutely no political party is promoting at the moment. So at least for a lot of people, that was an absolutely new idea, which partly explains why a lot of people also ticked I don't know that question, because they didn't really. So there is definitely some potential here for promoting these kinds of work, especially if we could get the message across that our basic needs will be met throughout the transition. If I can, I would just add one short thought about if we say we are committed to democracy, that doesn't mean that democracy has necessarily to stay exactly the same way as it is. So one way that we also work with is so-called citizen forums for needs satisfaction. This is again following Max Neef, which we the other Max that Miki mentioned beforehand. Basically, there we come together with citizens, a selection of them, and we discuss basically the ways that certain needs are satisfied at the moment, then we go on discussing how could it be done in an utopian way, and finally how to get from A to B. And this is kind of a way of trying to combine the more or less advanced academic knowledge of some kind of experts with the practical knowledge of people on the ground, which we think is a very good way to basically contextualize ideas we have about policy demands, and also actually ground them in people's life world. And also the examples we know from citizen assemblies, climate assemblies, at larger scales are actually also quite encouraging. From the example of France or in Ireland in particular, is actually that people are actually quite interested in talking about these things, especially when you tell them the truth, that basically as the climate movement says, that we really need to act actually yesterday, and that just as it was mentioned in the introduction, major shifts are necessary in all, in economic and social systems. Another thing, of course, is that the French political class did not really take up the suggestions that were worked out there in these assemblies, but I mean, that is not necessarily the case. It could be different.
Okay, so Shaun, I think you will have the concluding word, and since the time is up, then please be brief.
I would like to also add a sentence at the end about this.
Okay.
I will be as brief as I can. I won't try to answer things then, but just make some pointers. One line that's come to mind for me over the last few questions is Leopold Kohr's line, "Wherever something is wrong, something is too big." And I think there's this very natural inclination in us to think, oh, we've got this wonderful thing, let's make it global. I won't try to answer this, but I think there's something to reflect on there. I think there's something to reflect on in the difference between elections and democracy. There's a very good book by David von Raybrook, Against Elections, The Case for Democracy, and I think that needs reflection. And I loved what Miki said, we need places to hold our dilemmas. The network I'm part of is called Surviving the Future Conversations for Our Time, and again, it's one of these places where we can come together and hold these dilemmas together. And my closing line would be a quote from the Lakota elder Teokasin Ghost Horse, who once said to me, "In times of great urgency, slow down."
I just wanted to bring the example of participatory budgeting, which was done for many years in Porto Alegre until it was closed down. And what that did is it moved from individuals having opinions to deliberative bodies in large number, even up to 50,000 people in a city of 1.5 million. And the result was shift over the years that it was put together into reducing the inequality index, improvement in sanitation, in health, in education. And that was done by the people in a democratic process, not through elections, and without calling it some fancy name. Just let's see what we want the government of the city to spend its money on.
Wow. Thank you so much to all of you for participating in the debate, whether that's guests or the audience. It's my duty to apparently bring out 4 takeaways from this debate. 4 or 3, and I think maybe you might think about your own. What has been really interesting for me is this changing the idea for the post-growth culture to change the idea of security from accumulating a lot of money to actually investing, maybe in the economic sense, in building relationships and trust among people. On that note, Miki or Emma's vision of like resources flowing to where needs are rather than to where like money are. And then we talked a lot about this, at the end, like the shifting democracy, that it doesn't need to be undemocratic, but we need to change the practices and understanding of democracy so it could actually go to the like next level rather than just some political elections. Thanks a lot also for being here. The audience might be disappointed that you are all online and nobody was here in person, and yet in the like post-growth, degrowth fashion, I really yeah, I'm really grateful that we could connect with you without all of you flying all the way here. I think it connects to the topic that we were discussing, and I'm really happy we did have access to all of your like wisdom and experience. And I would also really like to invite all of you other people that are in here to join the rest of the debates, because we're going to go on with the degrowth program. And while this one was a little bit more about the human culture, how do we change this human subjectivity and yeah, redefine security and stuff like this, the debates that are going to follow up with Giorgos Kallis and then also later on Jennifer Hinton are also going to be looking a lot into actually can we change the market in a way that would be, you know, compatible with the degrowth future or other policy proposals. So these are the sessions that are going to follow up. I believe they're going to be super interesting. And they might join in as a puzzle, that you get one puzzle here and another one later on, unless you have read all the degrowth literature, which I don't think you have. And the last thing is that if either of you are interested in the non-violence that Miki and Emma were talking about, then I do have the books, some of the books, Svět nenásilí, that have been translated. They have been super like life-changing for me, so you can whether get them anywhere, since it's in Czech, which I think is pretty rare, or you can just get it in here, so you can, yeah, I'll be here afterwards. So have a nice rest of the day, and yeah, see you at other programs, and thanks again to all of you. I think you definitely deserve a massive applause.